You're listening to the Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast. Today's episode is called Breaking the Comparison Trap with Toxic In-Laws. Are you a Catholic wife grappling with challenging in-laws? The Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast is your sanctuary for navigating these sometimes stormy seas of life with toxic in-laws, while being validated for what you've experienced. Join me, your host, Miriam Susan, a Catholic wife who's weathered nearly 3 decades of in-law drama, as we tackle the tough issues you're dealing with head on. Hi, Miriam Susan. Welcome to today's episode where we are going to be talking about this comparison trap that you may be falling into regarding how toxic your in-laws are. And maybe you feel like they're just not that bad, so it's not a big deal. But we're going to dissect that today in this episode. I got an email last week from an email subscriber basically saying that her situation isn't nearly as bad as mine is, and then continued on to share some of her story. And so I wanted to let you know that if you've ever felt like your story doesn't seem bad enough to share, that you're not alone. And I want you to listen to today's episode to understand that toxic behavior exists on a spectrum. And whatever you're going through, it matters. It doesn't matter if the toxicity and manipulation is at a level 11, which is what mine feels like a lot of the time, or if you just feel like it's at a 2 or a 3. All of that matters. All of your experience matters. And I want to validate that no matter where your in-laws fall on this spectrum, it can cause stress. It can cause anxiety. It can cause issues in your marriage and within your family. So today's scripture reference is from the book of Galatians, chapter 6, verses 4 through 5, from the New Revised Standard Version, Catholic Edition. All must test their own work. Then that work, rather than their neighbor's work, will become a cause for pride, for all must carry their own loads. So let's expose this thought that you may have had. My situation is not that serious. It's not like yours, Miriam Susan. It's not that bad. Or maybe you think, maybe I am the problem. So what this kind of sounds like, it could be that you're thinking to yourself, well, at least they don't yell at me. Or they're just set in their ways. That's just how they've always done things. Or you might be thinking, well, other women have real problems. At least my in-laws aren't as bad as yours. So you need to think about that voice telling you that you need to be grateful enough because it's not worse. But that is not God's voice. Let me repeat that. That voice that's telling you, oh, my in-laws aren't that bad. My situation's not that bad. I need to be grateful that things aren't worse. That is not God's voice. It is not about a competition with a winner and a loser. I don't know if I would be considered a winner in that kind of competition. I think I'd probably be considered a loser in that competition. That's not how God sees us. Even subtle manipulation, it is still unhealthy. It is still manipulation. Things like a little eye roll when you say something that is important to you, or you share something that you're excited about and you get an eye roll, or passive-aggressive comments, or boundary testing, or things that make you question your own reality. That is still manipulation. That is still toxic behavior. Yes, it might not be toxic to the point where you fear for your life, but it can still be toxic. Mild toxicity is even harder to identify many times because when you can't point to what is considered obvious abuse, then you start to question your own reality and wonder if you are the one that's being too sensitive, if you are being too dramatic. So again, there is this spectrum of toxicity when it comes to this kind of behavior. Just because you don't have in-laws that have stalked you across state lines, shown up at places where they shouldn't be, that doesn't mean that the situation within your extended family is not harmful to you, to your marriage, and to your family. Then there's also this thing that I'm going to call the permission trap. This may be where you're thinking that I am being too dramatic, I need to be grateful that it's not worse. This is extremely draining because there is this exhaustion that comes with minimizing the behavior of your in-laws. And it is extremely draining to be in this constant state of downplaying our own needs and our own feelings. So where does this downplaying come from? Well, a lot of times it comes from society teaching us as women to minimize our feelings to just keep the peace. It's not that bad when your mother-in-law criticizes your potato salad. It's not that, is it really that big a deal? And these things can feel very petty. But when it is a consistent theme in the relationship, it is exhausting for us to take this burden of thinking that it is on us, that it's our fault because we're too sensitive, or we need to be grateful that it's not worse. No, that is minimizing what's actually going on. You may feel guilty for not being thankful that your in-laws only undermine you instead of screaming at you, instead of using drugs in front of your kids, instead of beating your kids. It's still toxic. It's still toxic. We often fall into this trap of needing permission to be upset. So when you measure your hurt against other people, you begin to lose sight of what is true for you. And when we minimize what is happening, we stay stuck, we don't seek help, and we don't trust our instincts. Just because things are not as bad for you as it might be for me or it might be for another woman, it does not mean that you need to pretend like it's not bad at all. Again, this is a spectrum. Some people will be more violent, more physically violent. Some people will be more covert and do like the subtle jabs, the eye rolls, the little knife in the back kind of things when nobody else is looking. It's all toxic. Why do we stay trapped in feeling this, well, it's not that bad. It's not bad enough to take action. It's not bad enough to say something to my husband. It's not bad enough to start drawing the lines and having some boundaries. It's not bad enough to get law enforcement or a lawyer involved. You should not have to justify why your in-laws' behavior hurts you. You shouldn't. Because if it's hurtful behavior, it's hurtful behavior. And you trying to justify it could make you look very petty. I know that there were so many times when I would come to my husband and I would tell him that I just did not feel comfortable around his mom, that I did not want to spend time alone with her. Oftentimes, very early on in our marriage, he would go on hunting trips, just day trips, with his dad. But that meant that I was home alone with his mom. Not technically alone. His sisters were there. My kids were there, but they were little. But it was still this time where it was just very uncomfortable. I couldn't quite put a name to it. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. I just didn't like being around her. And I shouldn't have had to justify why it was. Well, frankly, I didn't even know why. I just felt uncomfortable around her. There was this idea that I had that I had to explain why it was upsetting. But then that opens the door to, again, sounding like you're being petty, to your husband kind of explaining away whatever it is that you're feeling, and that just kind of leaves you stuck. You don't need to feel like you need permission to not enjoy being around your in-laws. Here are a couple signs that you might be minimizing the experience that you're having with your in-laws. You might make excuses for their behavior, like, well, she's old and she's set in her ways, or they're used to doing things the way they did for your husband's older siblings. And so you're just different and you come along, and that's why, there's this struggle in your relationship. Or maybe you feel guilty for being upset. Because like I said, a lot of these toxic behaviors, especially the ones that I have experienced, they're not major mic drop kind of things. It's going back to the episode that I did on the death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's all little things, but paper cuts, even if they're small, they still hurt. And paper cuts still can get infected. And when you have paper cut after paper cut after paper cut, it really adds up. Or you might be thinking that you're just overreacting. Obviously, your in-laws are going to do things different than your parents did. And especially, I think, if your parents had been toxic or continue to be toxic or have some, if you have some trauma from your childhood or growing up with your parents, there is a chance that you will think that you are overreacting if your in-laws don't behave as badly as your parents did. Again, it's this comparison that makes us think that whatever we're going through is not quite as bad as maybe we sometimes think it is. There is this isolation that happens when we think, well, it's not that bad. It's not bad enough. And this thinking keeps you from reaching out for support, whether it's from friends or your parish priest or a spiritual director or a therapist. This keeps you stuck in this toxic cycle of behavior with your in-laws. And what really matters is how it affects you. If it is affecting your peace, if it is affecting your spiritual life, if it is affecting your physical health, if it is affecting your marriage, if it is affecting your kids, it matters. The impact of this behavior matters. Again, whether it's a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10 or an 11, it matters. We have to keep in mind that God is not watching us and ranking our struggles. He's not saying, well, hers are not that bad. I think she's being dramatic. He's not saying that. He sees our hearts and he sees our pain and he sees our desire to have a loving, healthy relationship with our in-laws. And he sees where maybe the little or the big things that they do hurt us, hurt our relationship with our in-laws and the relationship that we have with our husband and our extended family. I want to pose a couple questions for you. What if you stopped comparing? How would your perspective change if you trusted your own experience? If you understood that there are women just like you experiencing strangely similar situations, how would that help you? How would that help you break free from this scale of thinking that, the behavior needs to be at least a 6 or 7 before I reach out to somebody and say something? Here's something that a lot of people don't talk about. Sometimes the people that get to the level 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, it started with things at levels 1, 2, and 3. So if you're at a level 1, 2, or 3, it could progress. It could get worse like it did for our family. This question, is this bad enough? This really isn't that bad, but is it bad enough that I need to do something about it? I want you to reframe that question and ask this question instead. Is this behavior good for my family? You see that? Very subtle difference, very subtle change in words. Is this good for me and my family? We're not talking about, is it bad enough? We're not talking about, is this a 7, 8, 9 on a scale of 1 to 10, or is this really a 2? No. Is this behavior good for my family? And I think that's a much better question to be asking yourself when these things come up, when it's just like the little tiny things that don't seem big on their own. But if you take a step back and think, is this good for my family? I think that gives you a more objective perspective on what is going on. With any of these situations of having toxic behavior coming from your in-laws, you will most likely, at some point, if you're not already there, experience the exhaustion that comes with these kinds of relationships. Because you get tired of questioning yourself. You get tired of making excuses for their behavior. You get tired of feeling like you are the problem. And it is mentally and sometimes physically exhausting to be going through that. So whether it is subtle digs at your parenting, subtle digs at the way you look, subtle digs the way you dress, the way you cook, the way you clean or don't clean your house, or whether it is downright hostility, physical violence, yelling, screaming, throwing things, calling Child Protective Services on you, really harsh hostility, harsh toxic behavior, toxic is toxic. I want to give you an example that will hopefully bring this to light in a way that makes sense and is something that you can take with you so that when you have these situations, you can have a story to remember, because stories are always easier to remember than me just spitting out a bunch of information. So let's think about a cookie. And it's a cookie geared to children. And in that cookie, it has lead. Now, lead, of course, is toxic. And there are recommendations as to how much lead is allowed in certain foods. Let's say that it comes out that this cookie that you have been feeding your child for months, for years, has just over the amount of lead that is legally allowed to be in food. Is that okay? No. It's still a toxic substance that is in a cookie that you have been feeding to your child. It doesn't matter that it's not 50% of the cookie. Toxic is toxic. It doesn't matter if the equivalent of toxic behavior with your in-laws is just above that minimum level. It can still cause problems. Just a tiny bit of lead in a cookie, especially if it's eaten over and over and over again, can build up. It can build up in your child's body. And so even though it was just a tiny bit in each cookie, it builds up over time. And over time, your child can start to experience some really toxic poisoning from the lead. It could be that if the cookie had 50% lead in the ingredients, then the toxicity would show up very rapidly. But it's still toxic. So even though your in-laws might only be doing something that's just barely considered toxic, over time, that builds up. Just like the lead would inside your child if they had a cookie that had lead in it. It's still toxic. So your pain does not need to measure up against anybody else's to be real and to be valid. That inner voice, whether you call it your conscience, whether it's your intuition, whether it's the Holy Spirit that is telling you something isn't right, I want you to trust it because you're not being too sensitive. I think the Holy Spirit and our intuition work together, and we are taught to ignore it. And I want you to stop doing that when you just have this feeling that something isn't right. Lean into it, dig a little deeper, try to piece it apart and figure out why it is that it is unsettling. Why is it that it makes you feel bad? Try to figure out what that voice is telling you so that then you have words to express and share when you reach out to somebody else. All of us deserve to have relationships that don't leave us questioning our own reality. I think that sometimes these relationships, well, I'll say they oftentimes will distract us from the calling God has for us, the work that He has for us to do. When we are so distracted and so caught up and stressed out and anxious and overwhelmed because of these relationships with our toxic in-laws, that means that we are not the wives, the mothers, the sisters, the parishioners, the daughters, the friends, the coworkers that we need to be, because so much of our mental energy is caught up in trying to navigate these very difficult, toxic relationships, no matter what your definition of very difficult is. I hope this episode has given you the permission, if you've been seeking the permission to feel like your experience is toxic and it is valid, I hope that this episode has given that to you. Because we don't have to compare our difficult relationships with anybody else's in order for them to be hurtful to us. What I can tolerate might be very different than what you can tolerate, but that doesn't even matter. What matters is, does this relationship bring good to your family or not? Is this good for me and my family? I hope that you use that question over and over again and even ask that of your husband. Honey, is this good for our family? Do you feel like this is good for our children to see your parents behaving this way? Do you think it's good for our children to see me being treated like this? Or you being treated in this way? That's a really powerful question. And I hope you can use that question to bring about a greater sense of peace within your family. God bless you. Go in peace. Now that we've wrapped up today's episode, I could really use your help. If this message resonated with you, would you take just 30 seconds to leave me a review? Reviews are how other Catholic wives can find this podcast, and you know how much we all need to know that we're not alone in this challenging journey. Your review might be exactly what another woman needs to realize that she's not crazy. It takes just a few seconds, but makes a huge difference. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. But before you go, I want you to know something. If you're feeling exhausted after every family visit, questioning whether you're overreacting, or if you're replaying conversations you had with your in-laws for days afterward, you're not crazy, and you're definitely not alone. I've created a free guide called 5 Signs You're Not Too Sensitive, What Your Gut is Really Telling You, that will help you to understand why these interactions feel so hard and give you some gentle scripts to use in those moments when you're caught off guard by your in-laws. You can grab a copy at desiringpeace.com/signs. That's desiringpeace.com/SIGNS. You're not asking for too much when you ask to be treated with respect. I'll talk to you next week. Disclaimer. All content and information on this podcast and our website, including our programs, products, and/or services, is for information and educational purposes only and does not constitute professional medical, psychiatric, or mental health advice of any kind, and does not establish any kind of professional client relationship by your listening to this podcast or use of my website. A professional client relationship with you is only formed after we have expressly entered into a written agreement with you that you have signed, including our fee structure and other terms to work with you in a specific matter. Although we strive to provide accurate general information, the information presented here is not a substitute for any kind of professional advice, and you should not rely solely on this information. Always consult a professional in the area for your particular needs and circumstances prior to making any professional, medical, or mental health related decisions.